So you can see the screen now. What I decided to do, we're going to talk about the three major women, the three women that are credited most with having contributed to the women's suffrage movement, but I've also thrown in a few other women very quickly that I thought we ought to kind of highlight. I will preface all of this by saying, as I said, with February and Black History Month, March is Women's History Month. The reality is every month is Women's History Month and Men's History Month and Native People's History Month and Black History Month. And we will eventually get to a point that we'll be able to reconcile and make certain that our historical text look at the contributions of all. But until that point, Women's History Month is indeed March. And the second slide will show you our topic for today. And we are going to be talking about the women's suffrage movement, about freedom's champions. And I love, the quote about well-behaved women seldom make history, because I think you're going to see with each of these women that we're going to spotlight today, we're going to be looking at women from all across the country. We'll hit a couple of women from here in Tennessee, but you'll see that all of them stepped outside what would have been considered the appropriate level of behavior and decorum for the time period. And they were able, by doing that and by taking some personal chances, to create change. So having said all of that, you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner of that slide is the Tennessee yellow rose emblem that was so prominently displayed all of last year as we celebrated Tennessee's role as the perfect 36, the state that in ratifying the 19th Amendment created that amendment becoming the law of the land as a part of the U.S. Constitution. So I had to get another little plug in there for Tennessee. Sometimes we make lists that we're not real proud of. This is a list that we're incredibly proud of. So let's go to the first slide. And I actually thought that I would go back and kind of start fairly early on. I did want to mention, because I think whenever you talk about women and women's rights, people tend to think of Abigail Adams. Now, the truth of the matter is that Abigail Adams was not a suffrage supporter necessarily. What she was certainly an advocate for women's rights. And she probably is the earliest documented founding mother who spoke out about women's rights. I think most all of us know her as having been born into a prominent Massachusetts family. Her father, the Reverend Smith, was well known, well respected. And while Abigail Adams herself was not well educated, in fact, she was part of a generation where girls certainly did not go to school, she did make avail of the incredible library that her father had. And so we know that Abigail could read Latin, she could read Greek, she knew history. She was most interested in subjects that many women at that time period were not able to be a part of. I included her today because you will remember, probably most of you will remember, that Abigail and John Adams exchanged letters almost their entire marriage, because the truth of the matter is, while John was off, helping to form the revolution, form the nation, serve as an ambassador to our foreign allies, and then later serving as president, so much of that time he was not in Massachusetts with Abigail. He was home enough that they did indeed have 5 children, but he was gone a lot. So they wrote their letters, which were never published during Abigail's lifetime, but later on, her letters would indeed be published by her grandson. So I think most people think of her and they think of the exchange of letters that occurred in 1776 when John is at the First and then Second Continental Congress. And she writes to him and says, "Do not put unlimited power in the hands of the husbands." I love this quote. "Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." And that's sort of an interesting statement to come out of. Well, John Adams was probably concerned about putting together the new nation and not particularly concerned about protection for women under the new Constitution that would have come about 15 years later or whatever. But what you find Abigail Adams saying to him, is a reminder. And we know that John Adams took very clearly from her letters, because he later in a letter, in fact, in 1797, will write to her when she is not with him. And this is a quote from him: "I never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life." She had become his closest advocate. You will remember that in that exchange of information, he will respond to her and say, I fear a revolution of petticoats, or that's a paraphrase. And she then responds to him, and this is a quote from her, and it says, "And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you should remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a revolution, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Now, that's a pretty strong statement for a female writing in 1776. That's when her husband responds and says that he's a little concerned about a disposition by the petticoats. And she responds to him that she is very serious about allegations that if the men are going to earn their liberty from Britain, then the women also need to be a part of that independent republic. So she's our first strong advocate for women's rights. And I think those words of "just remember the ladies" have become such a hallmark. Now, let's meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is our next person that we're going to take a look at. And you'll notice Elizabeth Cady Stanton will kind of fall in the middle of the three big leaders of the women's suffrage movement, the three women who are honored in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol with a statue in which the three of them are depicted together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you'll notice, is born in 1815. And her most significant quote, which I always enjoy, is simply a paraphrase of what Jefferson had written in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, if you think about it, 206 years old, because one of the picture that I have down there in the smaller is from the centennial of her birth back in 1915, because you'll notice that she had died in 1902, and by 1915, the women's suffrage movement was really beginning to heat up here in the United States. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton at that point had become, and you'll see her referenced in a lot of the literature, is the guardian angel who is looking over all of them, because she at that point is long deceased. She's been dead for 13 years, but she is a fascinating person to take a look at and think a little bit about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an author. She lectured. She was the primary philosopher of this early triumvirate of women's suffrage leaders. She, Anthony and Mott will both credit her with having been the person who does so much of the thinking and the writing. She will allow the other two to speak more often, but she will be the one who is thinking. She's born in upstate New York. She's very fortunate in that she is able to attend school. She attends Johnstown Academy, and then she goes off to Emma Willard, which is still around today. Her father was a noted attorney, and she would later say that as he would prepare for trials or would be writing briefs or whatever, he would read them and try them out on her as an audience. So she became quite a formidable writer and very good at being able to think quickly and formulating arguments too. Now, she gets married in 1840, at the age of 25, which was a little bit older for women at that point, but she marries a guy by the name of Henry Stanton, who is an abolitionist, and he is a well-known abolitionist lecturer. He would travel around. and she becomes actively involved in the abolitionist movement. And one of the things that you'll see in a lot of these early suffrage leaders is the fact that they see injustice anywhere is injustice across the board. So many of them will be for women's rights. They will be concerned about abolition. They'll be concerned about mental health issue rights, all those sorts of things that sort of run the gambit of the issues that we're dealing with in the 19th century during a period of reform and interest in reform. Now, I found it interesting. On her honeymoon, she and her husband went to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Conference. So obviously, abolition was a big deal for them. So they're going to combine the honeymoon along with a little bit of social work. And it is at that meeting that she meets Lucretia Mott. And Lucretia Mott is a little bit older than she is. And they both attempt to attend the conference, and they are both denied access into the lectures and the presentations because they are female. They decide there on the spot that when they get back to the States, that they're going to go to work on calling a women's rights convention. And of course, I think we all know that in 1848, their work will come to fruition when they will hold the first women's rights conference in Seneca Falls, New York. And it will be Elizabeth Cady Stanton who will author the Declaration of Sentiments, which is a play on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. She changes the word man to woman or to women throughout the document. And in it, she calls for social and legal changes that would allow women to be looked at as equal to men in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of rights. She is very clear that she's not looking for women to be elevated beyond men, that she is simply looking for an equality. So she's going to address what she finds to be, she thinks, the most glaring discrepancies in men and women's rights. And they include things like women not being able to, in many cases, work outside the home and negotiate for their wages, that they simply have to take whatever they're given. The ability of women to own property, an issue that will be really near and dear to her heart as a mother who is going to be balancing all of this work while also raising a number of children. She's very concerned about the fact that under 19th century law in this country, custodial rights are automatically given to husbands in the event of a divorce, and that divorce is looked for. A woman could not, in most areas, file for divorce, but a husband could. So, she is very, very concerned about all of those sorts of things. She will maintain that interest in women's rights and issues related to slavery and abolition will be her top priorities, but she'll sort of shift from abolition, leaving her husband dealing with that. In 1851, when she becomes acquainted with Susan B. Anthony, and she and Susan B. Anthony will become fast collaborators, where she and Lucretia Mott had dreamed of this new group of women who were going to fight for women's rights. And Lucretia Mott, we'll talk about in a few minutes, will provide a lot of that background. She sees in Susan B. Anthony the voice that can get out there and travel when she is not always as someone who has children able to do. So they will begin to collaborate in writing speeches. They will write articles. They'll write books. It's going to be a partnership that will continue until death will separate them. By 1862, the Stantons have left upstate New York and they're in New York City, and they will become, again, looking at issues related to suffrage and to civil rights. But she will be most concerned when, coming out of the Civil War, once the 13th Amendment is passed and Congress comes out with the 14th and 15th Amendments, she and Susan B. Anthony both will take to the streets to protest against the 14th and the 15th Amendments, not because they're not interested in citizenship and the right to vote for formerly disenfranchised Black males, but because Congress is obviously choosing, and she believed it was a choice on their part, not something they simply had neglected to think about, have chosen to neglect the women and to not extend the franchise or the full rights of citizenship to women. Because of that, she and Anthony will together form the National Women's Suffrage Association. And they will start a newspaper journal that will be called The Revolution, which sort of gives you an idea of where they're thinking. Now, Stanton will become the editor and the author of most of their works, and she'll be the one that will be really outspoken socially and politically. She will debate a number of the major political questions of the day, and she will begin to advance this entire idea of women's right to vote, women's right to be a part of the legislative process. I mean, things that were so incredibly controversial at that point that it's hard to imagine. Real quickly before we leave her, one of the last things that she will do is she will write a 3-volume history of women's suffrage. And it takes her a period of about 4 years to do it. It is an incredible resource today to look back, and I find it fascinating to see the depth of thought and perception that a lot of these early women thought, the depth of their convictions and the depth of their arguments and the persuasiveness and the legal context with which they were able to argue it. She also will author a women's Bible in which she goes through and tries to point out the things in the scriptures that she believes looks at all of God's children as equals in the eyes of God. And she is going to, in very clear form in a number of articles, put forth the fact that the inequality between men and women was not necessarily created by the Creator, but it was an interpretation of church doctrine that was necessary to keep women quiet and in their position. And again, writing in the 1880s and the 1890s, the last few years of her life, she's not as well as she was. That was an incredibly controversial stance to take. Next person on our list is Mary Church Terrell, and she is, you'll notice, 1863. So she is born to she is the daughter of former slaves. Her parents had gained their freedom right prior to her birth, but she was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and she is one of probably the most celebrated of the African-American suffrage leaders, and she was celebrated all across the nation last year as we were looking at the 19th Amendment. And for her work, there was a lot of attention focused on Tennessee. Now, she was born in Memphis. Her father was an incredibly successful businessman, and he was one of the first African-American millionaires in the South. And so she was, within her community, upper class, but even within Memphis in the 1880s, she is middle class. Her mother was relatively well educated. She has one brother. She is educated. She goes off to Antioch College Laboratory, which was sort of their high school. And then she is a graduate of Oberlin College. She earned both her undergraduate and her master's there. And she spent a couple of years teaching at Wilberforce College. And then she moved to Washington, D.C. because she felt as an educator there, she had a greater chance of influencing others who lived in the city, with her target, of course, being the halls of Congress and the ability to really evoke change there. She got not only interested in women's suffrage, but when a friend of hers that she had grown up with as a childhood friend in Memphis was lynched, she becomes very outspoken about racial inequities and what she sees as the use of mob rule and lynching across the South. She becomes one of the founders of the NAACP. She's very active very early on. Her motto was lifting as we climb. So she was a founder also of the National Association of Colored Women, which was part of the NAACP, and she was the national president from 1896 to 1901 at a very pivotal time. So she's working alongside W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, others who are very actively involved. Her argument with women's suffrage was that suffrage was essential to elevating the status of Black women and therefore the entire race. She was very eloquent in saying that women's suffrage and civil rights belong to all people, and that interestingly, Black women in particular were the only group that had two obstacles that they had to overcome to have equal political and civil rights, and that was race and sex, which became an outspoken cry as Black and white women joined together in the suffrage movement. It's interesting. She wrote her autobiography toward the end of her life, and it was called A Colored Woman in a White World. And it was a focus on what she saw as subtle forms of discrimination, even though she had walked and worked side by side with white women as a part of the suffrage movement. So she would continue until the end of her life, because in 1950, at the age of 86, she will bring suit against a restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was still segregating patrons by race. And she was victorious in that battle. And that was only 4 years before she died at the age of 90. So Mary Church Terrell was a strong mover and shaker for women's rights, but also for African American rights. So on to Susan B. Anthony, who is our next person on our list. Okay, Susan B. Anthony. Love those pictures. Every photograph that I find of Susan B. Anthony, I am always mesmerized by her eyes, this almost penetrating eagle view that she has. I mean, she's just a fascinating woman, and you can see it here even in her as an older woman with the front picture. What I think I like so much about Susan B. Anthony and why I like to talk about her so much is that for her, women gaining the right to vote was only the first step. And you look at that, she's born in 1820. She dies in 1906. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will die within a matter of about 18 months of each other. And yet she's looking so far into the future, and her quote gives evidence to that, where she will say, and notice, there never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make the laws and elect the lawmakers. So it's not just a question of electing the lawmakers, but with those political rights of being able to vote should come the equality of being able to serve in the halls of Congress and to be a part of making those rights. Now, she probably, if we went out on the streets, and the United States is probably the most recognizable figure in the women's suffrage movement. Part of that may be the Susan B. Anthony dollar. Part of that is, there are those who have advocated for a long time that she shouldn't be on just a coin dollar, but she should be on some of the more used either coins or paper money. I think people just know the name Susan B. Anthony. Now, she's a Massachusettsian. And she, interestingly, is a Quaker. And she was inspired, she always said, by the Quaker belief that everyone is equal in the eyes of God. And that she said that was the idea that guided her throughout her life. And obviously that was a lesson she learned really well at home. Because one of the things that I found when I was researching her back last year when we were working on the Tennessee 100 committee was that she was one of 8 children, and all 8 of them became activists for justice and emancipation of slavery, women's rights. All 8 of the Anthony children became advocates and became activist out there on the streets doing things. So I find that fascinating. Obviously, the parents did something at home that stuck with those kids. Um, she spent her first years teaching, and then she moved to New York, and there she became really good friends with William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, and who were friends of her father's, but she became friends with them herself. And as she listened to them, she became really interested in slavery. So she became an abolitionist activist, and she was very passionate about that. And she would go out in public and would speak about the abolition of slavery and why it was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord, and everything. And in many places, she was scorned because it was not considered appropriate for a woman to be speaking in public places in mixed company. So, the head of that well-behaved women rises again. In 1848, because a number of her abolitionist friends were also interested in women's issues, she made the decision to attend the Seneca Falls Conference. And of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had been the ones who put that together. Well, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as I mentioned before, will become really, really close friends. They will also create a group called the American Equal Rights Association. I mean, they're just creating all of these groups everywhere, trying to solicit people to get involved, men and women, people of color, and those who were white citizens. Her greatest skill, Stanton is the writer. Stanton is the legal mind and how to put together all of these arguments. Anthony's greatest skill, Stanton will say, is that she was a strategic thinker, that she was disciplined. She was incredibly high energy, didn't sleep very much at all, up early, ready to go, and high energy all day. And that she had this almost innate ability to organize ideas, but even more so to organize people. And Stanton would say that Anthony, in organizing people, made each individual person feel as though they were the single most important person within the team. And as a result, she was an incredibly successful leader. They put together the newspaper, which I mentioned, The Revolution, to spread those ideas about equality and rights for women. She will also go out and lecture and will charge for people to attend her lectures, because the money raised from that will then support the women's movement and support the newspaper. She becomes quite famous across the nation by the 1850s, prior to the American Civil War, and people were sort of lined up on both sides of the streets. Those who loved her and were just, absolutely fascinated by her ability to speak and to articulate, in many cases, what Stanton had written for her, but she's going to be the voice of the revolution. And on the other side of the street are those who hated her, hated the ideas, and thought she was terribly inappropriate at what she was doing. Probably one of the things that many people remember about her is that in 1872, Susan B. Anthony shows up to vote in a senatorial and a presidential election. And she is not only not allowed to vote, she is arrested. She is put on trial, and she is fined $100, which in 1872, $100 is a fairly significant sum of money. A number of people who really had not been paying a whole lot of attention to the whole idea of women's equity, equality, became incensed when they learned about her arrest and the trial. And it actually added momentum to the national suffrage movement. She will, in 1876, lead a protest. There will be a centennial of the nation's independence occurring in Washington, D.C., and Susan B. Anthony, on an opposing stage, will get up and lead a protest about, the centennial of the nation's independence, when the independence has only been given to half of the population. She gives a speech called the Declaration of Rights, which had been written by Stanton and one of Stanton's friends. she'll spend her life working on women's rights issues. She is able to bring together the two women's suffrage groups, one a little more revolutionary in nature, one a little more conciliatory, but she's able to bring them together to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she'll get that group together and work with them until 1900. She's going to travel across the nation. She gives speeches. She gathers thousands of signatures on petitions. That something that she found to be incredibly helpful is that if she could put together petitions of voters district by district for those, and those petitions were presented to those members of Congress who were fearful of re-election, that could be a powerful tool. Unfortunately, she will die, you'll notice, in 1906, a full 14 years before women have the ability to gain those equal rights. If we move on to our next person, hopefully somebody will ask me a question here in a minute or put something. Probably a person that you may not have heard of, and Mary Ann Shadd, who will become Mary Ann Shadd Carey, is born in 1823, and she will, you'll notice, according to that, live to be 70, but she is one of those unsung African-American women's suffrage leaders during a particularly difficult time to be African-American and talking about suffrage rights. She is an activist. She's a poet, she's a writer, she's a teacher, and she's an attorney. And I find it fascinating. She was born in 1823 in Delaware. Her parents, Delaware was a slave state, but her parents were freed Americans who could trace their lineage back to the American Revolution. When she was 10, they moved to Pennsylvania, which was a free state, and they became a family associated with the Underground Railroad. They participated in the Underground Railroad. Their home, later she shared their home was a site, a location on the railroad. And when Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, she and her family protested that because, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act made it not only, as a part of the Compromise of 1850, not only did fugitive slaves, were they going to be forcibly returned to the plantations or areas in the South from which they had escaped, but families, of course, that had given refuge to them would be punished severely also. And so at that point, she and her family will move to Canada. They're going to stay actively involved, but they realize this is a dangerous time to be of color when you're talking about abolition and you're beginning to think about women's rights also. So she marries in Ontario. She opens a school, an integrated school for both Black and white students. And as she begins to talk about the importance of freedom for Black citizens, for Blacks in the United States, Blacks anywhere, she begins to realize the overlay between rights for those of color and rights for women. And she will launch her own newspaper called the Provincial Freeman. She is the first female Black newspaper editor in North America when she publishes that newspaper. In 1860, her husband dies, the Civil War breaks out, and she returns to the United States, where she is going to be actively involved in recruiting African-American soldiers for the Union Army. At the same time, she's going to teach during the daytime, attend Howard Law School as a member of their first their law school class, and she's going to be recruiting soldiers for the Union Army. She's doing all of that simultaneously so obviously this is somebody else who doesn't need a whole lot of sleep. She gets involved in the suffrage movement during the American Civil War. She joins the National Women's Suffrage Movement. She will speak at the 1878 convention. She and Stanton will become good friends. It's interesting because the only point where we can find that she and Stanton and Susan B. Anthony differ is that she will be very vocal in her support of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to men who were formerly slaves, men of color, because she said that while she agreed with Stanton and Anthony that women should have been included, that any step up the ladder was a step in the right direction, and that was a place to grow the movement from. You'll notice, and I thought it was kind of appropriate, her quote that I put up for you: self-reliance is the fine road to independence. Again, this idea that and that's something you'll hear Booker T. Washington say, is that if you want to be equal, and if you're, whether it's a woman or a person of color, one of the things, unfortunately, in a system where the laws have to be changed, you need to be able to prove that you are indeed able to exercise the powers and the rights to which you are advocating that be given to you. And I think Mary Ann Carey is a prime example of someone who was able to juggle a lot of things during her lifetime and have a profound impact on the women's suffrage movement, and yet sort of slides into obscurity because, so often at that point in time, the cameras, the newspapers, the newspaper stories were focused on the women who were not of color, who were leading the movement. Here in Tennessee, it's Abby Crawford Milton, Sue Shelton, and Dallas Dudley, and others. And only really by going back and looking at the records in the journals and in some of the newspapers do you find that Frankie Pierce of Nashville, who was an African-American woman, was so incredibly involved in lobbying for that 19th Amendment ratification here in Tennessee. The newspapers just didn't carry that. And some of it was fear that the blending of abolition, the blending of equal rights for those of color and women's rights together might lessen the power and the impact of either of those issues. So let's go on to Lucretia Mott, the elder statesman of women's suffrage. She is our next slide, and this is from a portrait, a photograph that was made of Lucretia Mott toward the end of her life. But you'll notice that she is our senior stateswoman. She was born in 1793, and to put that in perspective, George Washington is president. She also is a Quaker. She's from Nantucket, actually, in Massachusetts, and she too will share a commitment to feminism, although she will look at it as extended even beyond just the right to vote, but she also will be an abolitionist. She too will be a very early, fiery, powerful orator. Again, a Quaker, raised in that faith that says that there is an equality of all people under God. She attended a Quaker boarding school in upstate New York. She moves to Philadelphia. She marries her father's business partner, who was quite older than her, and then her father will die, leaving the family with a tremendous amount of debt. And that's part of what will sort of pique her interest in women having the right to own businesses, to be a part of the business process, to own property, because together, she, her husband, and her mother will salvage her father's business, and they will become, quite integral in that community. She will teach school while her mother runs the shop and her husband runs the textile business, and they all work together to make it profitable. All of that really sort of gives impetus to the fact that she gets involved in the American Anti-Slavery Society in the 1830s. Now, she will become a writer and a speaker in that movement, and it will be there that she will come in contact with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and that they will become lifelong friends. Of course, she will die 20 plus years prior to both Stanton and Anthony, but they will work together so much. You know, when they were excluded from being able to attend that conference in 1840 in London, it just really fired them up. And Mott will become very close friends with Frederick Douglass. She's going to be, you know, Stanton's going to be writing the sentiments, but you're going to find Mott writing a discourse on women, which is a timeline and a very recent account of history, the history of women's repression all the way through history, beginning back with the ancient times. While she's focused on women's rights, she will continue to fight for the end of slavery and then eventually for the end of the Jim Crow laws and those things that she sees as separating people by race or by gender. She will be the first president of the American Equal Rights Association. She's also really involved in the creation of Swarthmore College, and she feels very strongly that it should be co-educational. And of course, even in the 1860s, that was still controversial. There were women's colleges, there were men's colleges. It wasn't often that you found people being educated side by side, but Mott is a really forward thinker in this idea of equality of all people under God, and that she believes that there's a lot to be gained in the different ways that men and women approach issues. And she really writes some of the earliest works that talk about different styles of learning and different types of intelligence and how blending all of those together she sees as the advancement of human freedom. So she's going to be really interested, even in those latter years of her life, about women's rights, Black rights, education, economic rights. An incredible person when we talk about suffrage. And then the last person I thought we'd mention today is Ida B. Wells, because Ida B. Wells, many of you may know as a newspaper publisher, a journalist, born in Olive Branch, Mississippi, but came to Memphis, lives in Memphis for a period of time. And she is going to be a strong voice, a rather strident voice at times, because she is going to be very concerned about issues related to inequities with women and with people of color. You know, one of the things that her parents did for her was they instilled in her the importance of education, and she sees education as the pathway to equality, and education as that pathway to equality should be open to all, to men, to women, to people of color, to those who are white. And she believes that the greatest tool of education is not necessarily textbooks, but it's newspapers. And she goes back to what Jefferson, and I'm paraphrasing Jefferson, but you'll remember that Jefferson talks about the fact that if he had to choose a republic, he could not imagine a republic that would ever survive very long without freedom of the press and freedom of the newspapers. Wells' parents will die. She will be left to raise her brother and sister. She will take a job teaching, and she will move out of northern Mississippi and into Memphis. In 1884, Ida B. Wells will sue the train line there in Memphis because the conductor attempts to remove her from first class. She had bought a first class ticket. She had seated herself, and he came to remove her. Now, her story of that encounter, you need to read it sometimes. I wish I had put the quote up on the screen for you. She says that she bit him, that as he put his hand on her body to physically eject her from first class, that she clamped her teeth down on his hand, and that he shrieked and screamed. And while ultimately she was removed from her seat, she felt certain that her teeth marks would never be removed from his hand. So that's a little, gives you an idea of why she was known as a fiery woman. She she will actually win the court case in the Memphis courts, but it will be appealed to a higher court and it will be overturned there. And then she begins to investigate the way that court cases are handled. And she will take the power of the press and begin to sit in court and particularly observe the way that courts are treating women and men of color. So her issues for women's rights to vote, women's suffrage will extend to then equal treatment before the law, which she sees as a natural outgrowth of that right to be a part of the political process. She travels internationally. She will talk an awful lot about the difficulty that women of color in particular have in pushing forward. There will be a confrontation actually in 1915 at a women's march in Washington, D.C., when Alice Paul, and most of you know Alice Paul from Iron Jawed Angels. If you haven't seen that, you really need to see it. But Alice Paul, being aware of the political ramifications, will segregate the march that was going to occur in front of the White House, with all of their banners, to President Wilson. And she asks the women who were there, the suffrage workers who were of color, to be at the back of the line. And Ida Wells refuses to comply with that. And they will come to words about it. But as a result, they will become, if not friends, at least acquaintances who agree that they are both fighting for the same cause, and they need to figure out how to do that in a way that will be politically successful, but will make certain that the right of women to vote will extend also to African American women. So Ida B. Wells is the last person I wanted to bring up on the screen today. We certainly could have talked about Alice Paul. There are so many others that we could talk about. But I think you see a consistent thread when we talk about the women's suffrage movement across the nation in that period beginning. Thank you, Christine. When, if you think about the earliest writings beginning with Abigail Adams, but you really begin to see it coming to be in the 1830s and the 1840s, coming to Seneca Falls in 1848. And then as the storm clouds gather for the issues related to abolition, to states' rights, and all those sorts of things that are going to lead to the American Civil War, you see the same sort of gathering force for women's rights to suffrage. And yet it's going to take, another 70 years before women will gain the right to vote. And I think that's, when you look at these women and you realize that someone like a Stanton begins working in 1840, and when she dies in 1904, she is still committed. She is still writing up through 1900, 1901, still pushing, still, publishing, still doing all of that. That's a 60-year commitment to a dream. I think that sort of puts things in historical perspective. I know that sometimes when I get involved in things and you look at something taking months and years, it's so easy to lose steam, to lose maybe hope. And yet you see Stanton from 1840 until 1901 or so, when she does her last writing, 61 years. You see Susan B. Anthony, who meets her in 1851, and Anthony will stay actively involved until her death in 1906. Another 60-year span. And I think it's a reminder for us that while we want sometimes for things to change immediately, and certainly things should change swiftly, it should not have taken so long for the abolition of slavery. We should not have had to have dealt with Jim Crow laws, the equal rights for women. Certainly, in the 1960s, that was still a protest that those of us that are old enough as small children can remember issues related to women's rights. That may be the major issues that relate to equality or ongoing battles, and that not only do we have to work hard to move forward, but we also have to stay the course to make certain that we don't slide backwards. And thank you. And I know that we need to be off by 5:30. We've got about 6 minutes before we shut down. If anyone has a comment they'd like to make, or a statement they'd like to make, or maybe an inspirational woman in your life that you want to do a shout out to say thank you for someone having taught you a mantra, as the Anthonys were taught at their home, or Lucretia Mott and Stanton, as Quakers were taught in their homes, the whole idea of equality. You know, some of the things that we hold dearest are those concepts taught to us when we're small children. So I'll relinquish the floor and let others jump in if they'd like to.
I remember last year, 2020 was the 100th anniversary, and there were a lot of great articles in the paper, and some of them articles you wrote. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's what struck me, was how much time it took. You know, we take things for granted today. We don't realize that it was like when they first started in Seneca Falls to when women got the right to vote, that was 100 years.
It was. And I mean, you think about that.
Unbelievable. And then Black women, the right to vote, 1965. You know, I mean, that's just yesterday.
It is.
And all these things we're still fighting for.
Exactly. Even still challenges to the right to vote. And, you know, my Facebook post today is the last day to vote in the Chattanooga city elections was vote. You know, I don't care which of the 16 candidates you vote for, but that right to vote was so incredibly hard fought for that right. And to just, as we do so often in this country, just decide you're not going to vote is such a slap in the face of those who, you know, women, men, people of color. Native Americans didn't really get the right to vote until 1928. I mean, you look at all of that and think, how can you not vote when it was such a difficult process?
Yeah, I know. And one of my heroes was my mother, and she dragged me to a lot of those women's right marches. And she's not, you know, a lib Mother Nature type. She's well-educated Brit. She's from England, Oxford, you know, and still in the 70s, we were all doing that. And I'm traipsing along as a teenager. But the bottom line is that there's hope. And my mother always said that this democracy of ours still works. It just takes a long time. And you need the conversation, you need the reaction and the pushback and everybody dealing with it. And then what I'm learning now at this age is listening to the iGen and the younger kids who are like, you know, what are you guys talking about? This is just normal. And then waiting to see when they start to vote, what their reactions are going to be. And it's just this amazing process that hopefully goes in a good direction.
Oh, and you're exactly right. And you know what, to your mother's credit, the Brits got involved in women's suffrage, you know, really in a very formidable way on the streets marching before we really did in this country so much. So I envy you having been able to see all of that, walking alongside her. What an incredible young adulthood to have been a part of. You need to write that all down somewhere. Sending you off with another project. And I will just real quickly, and I know we're about out of time. I used to tell my students when I signed my first teaching contract in 1972, I was 19 and was not married, but my teaching contract said, I am not pregnant, nor do I have any intention of becoming pregnant during this academic year. And were I to become pregnant, I would resign before 3 months. And I would tell students that, you know, at GPS, and they'd go, what? And I said, you know, in the early 1970s, post 1960 civil rights, you could not teach in a classroom in many places in this country if you were visibly pregnant, because that was considered inappropriate. It would take people's thoughts in the wrong direction or something. And of course, my students used to just laugh and roll on the floor